When I was just 14, my world tilted on its axis in a way I never saw coming. Up until that point, things were far from perfect, but at least they were familiar. My mom, after years of raising me on her own, decided she was ready to remarry. She said she found someone stable, dependable, someone she could build a future with. His name was Martin, and he came with more than just a charming smile and promises. He had a 17-year-old son from his previous marriage, a boy named Jason. From the outset, Jason and I were oil and water. It wasn't just the 3-year age difference, it was everything about him. He had this smug confidence, like he'd seen the world and had nothing to prove. Meanwhile, I was still trying to figure out how to fit into my own skin, let alone a new family dynamic. The wedding happened quickly, and barely had the ink dried on their marriage certificate before tension started crackling like static in our home. At first, it was the kind of stuff that seemed almost laughable. Small arguments, minor turf wars. Jason would leave his dirty dishes in the sink, clearly expecting someone else to handle them, and that someone usually ended up being me. Then my mom would walk in, spot the mess, and I'd get the lecture about responsibility in keeping the kitchen clean. My protests never landed. To them, it always seemed like I was the instigator, the troublemaker. Other times, it was my shampoo mysteriously disappearing, only for Jason to show up with that familiar scent clinging to his hair. He'd smirk if I said anything, like he was daring me to tell on him, knowing full well no one would believe me. It wasn't just about the annoyances, it was about the imbalance, the unfairness that grew more glaring every day. Martin, my new stepdad, had this way of pinning every mishap, every misstep squarely on my shoulders. A towel left on the bathroom floor? My fault. TV too loud? Must have been me. Even if I wasn't home, somehow the blame found its way to me. And Mom? She had gone from being my advocate to an eternal peacemaker, always smoothing things over. She refused to see the favoritism. She'd shrug and say, "Jason's still adjusting," as if I wasn't, as if my struggles were less valid. Things took a bigger nosedive a year into the marriage. That's when the big announcement came. Mom was pregnant. They were expecting a baby. Martin was ecstatic. Mom glowed. And me, I was quietly shoved further into the background. Every conversation revolved around baby names, crib options, and nursery colors. The house was being transformed, and guess which room got sacrificed for the cause? Mine. I was moved to the guest room, if you could even call it that. It was barely larger than a walk-in closet. My things didn't fit. My bed took up most of the floor space, and the tiny window made it feel more like a cell than a bedroom. It wasn't just a physical relocation. It felt symbolic, like they were making space for the real family while pushing me aside. As my little half-brother grew up, it became obvious that he was the golden child. Everything he did was met with praise and adoration. Jason, who already acted like the king of the castle, seemed to take that as permission to get even more out of line. He dropped out of college not long after enrolling and came back home full-time, dragging with him a storm of chaos. Our home turned into a late-night hub for his sketchy friends. Music would blast into the early hours, and the scent of smoke and cheap beer hung in the air like a curtain you couldn't brush aside. Complaints were useless. Martin would shrug, and Mom's eyes would soften, as if she were trying to protect Jason from the weight of his own choices. "He's figuring things out," she'd say. I started finding reasons to stay away. After-school clubs, study groups, weekend hangouts at friends' places, anything to avoid walking through that front door. My grades improved, but not because of their support. School became my sanctuary, the only place I felt seen, where I had some control over my life. An evening stands out more than any other. I had stayed late for a group project, and by the time I got home, the house was silent. No TV, no music, no Jason yelling at his Xbox. Just silence. Curious, I walked into the kitchen and saw a sticky note on the fridge. "Out to dinner, family night." Oh. That's all it said. The note stung more than any shouting match ever could. Family night. They hadn't even mentioned it. No invitation, no heads up. Just left without me. It wasn't that I particularly wanted to spend time with them. It was the fact they didn't even think to include me. Unless they needed someone to blame, I wasn't part of the equation. The final straw came shortly after I turned 18. I'd been working part-time at a local bookstore, quietly saving up money. Martin constantly complained about it, claiming it would interfere with school, but I knew it wasn't about my academics. He just didn't like me being away from home, away from his control. One day I returned to find my room in chaos. Jason had hosted another party, and somehow my room had been used, trashed, and left in ruin. My science project, weeks of careful work, was soaked in beer. The lamp was broken, clothes strewn across the floor. My sanctuary had been violated. At breakfast the next morning, I stood there, seething, waiting for some acknowledgement. Martin barely looked up from his newspaper. "You should be more careful with your things," he said flatly. That was it. No apology, no responsibility taken, just blame. Mom, looking exhausted, murmured something about how family means forgiveness and how we needed to stick together. But I was done sticking together with people who couldn't even pretend to care. I had spent years trying to be invisible, trying not to cause waves, but it never mattered. Every step I took, every decision I made was scrutinized, not out of love, but out of suspicion. Meanwhile, Jason lounged around jobless, dodging accountability like it was an Olympic sport. And the baby? He was treated like royalty, with every little coup praised like it was a miracle. I tried to work on another science project once, needing quiet, needing space. I set up in the living room since my bedroom offered none. It was a disaster. Jason turned up the volume on his music just to get under my skin. My little brother ran circles around me, screaming. Martin told me my stuff was cluttering the space and that I should move it. That day, something inside me snapped. All I'd ever wanted was to be treated fairly, to have a place where I belonged. But clearly, this house wasn't it. Not anymore. With my patience worn thin and frustration bubbling over, I gathered up my science project, stuffed it into my backpack as gently as I could manage, and walked straight to my best friend's house. Her home had always been my escape hatch, a place of comfort and calm. Her parents, warm and welcoming, never asked probing questions. They just smiled, ushered me inside, and offered me space in their quiet dining room to work. Sitting at that table, with nothing but the soft ticking of a wall clock and the occasional hum of conversation in the next room, I finally exhaled a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for months. It hit me hard in that moment, how deeply off course my home life had veered. What was normal for others had become a luxury for me, the ability to focus, to breathe, to exist without tension or fear of being blamed. My friend, noticing how my shoulders dropped the minute I sat down, smiled and said softly, "You're always welcome here." It was such a simple gesture, yet it settled in my heart like warmth after a long winter. That single sentence crystallized everything I had been feeling. A home shouldn't be a battlefield or a prison. It should be your safe haven, a refuge. The realization dug deep. I wasn't running away from home for the fun of it. I was escaping something toxic, something that had drained me emotionally for far too long. I started grabbing every shift I could at my part-time job. The little bookstore on Main Street became more than a paycheck. It was a sanctuary. The air smelled of paper and old ink, and the customers were often lost in their own worlds, just like me. Every hour spent restocking shelves or organizing displays gave me a chance to breathe without stepping on emotional landmines. Martin, my stepdad, didn't hide his disdain for my growing independence. He claimed the job was a distraction from school, but I knew that wasn't the real issue. What bothered him was that I was no longer easily accessible, no longer a convenient scapegoat for everything that went wrong at home. My absence disrupted his narrative. As the months passed and my savings account grew, a plan began to solidify in my mind. I needed out, not just emotionally but physically. I started researching studio apartments near the college I hoped to attend. I calculated budgets late into the night, often running on caffeine and determination. The idea of living alone was intimidating, but it was the only path that promised peace. Eventually, the day came when I could no longer keep it to myself. I had found a modest but clean apartment not far from campus. The rent was manageable and the neighborhood was safe. I practiced what I would say over and over in my head until I could repeat it without my voice shaking. That evening, I asked my mom and Martin to sit down. My heart thudded in my chest like a war drum. "Mom, do you mean what?" I said, trying to keep my tone steady and confident. The air seemed to freeze. Martin was the first to react, his tone drenched in disbelief and condescension. "You think you're ready to live on your own, at your age?" he scoffed, shaking his head like I was a child pretending to be grown up. My mother just stared at me, her expression unreadable, lips pressed into a thin line. "I am," I replied. "I've saved enough. I need my own space. This isn't healthy for me anymore." I held her gaze, silently begging her to understand. What followed was an emotional brawl, words sharpened into weapons. Martin accused me of being ungrateful, of abandoning the family that took me in. He called me selfish, accused me of shirking responsibilities, particularly toward my younger half-brother. "He looks up to you," he said, as if guilt was supposed to override everything else. But I had reached my limit. I was done being the sacrificial lamb to keep everyone else comfortable. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I just stood my ground. This wasn't rebellion, it was survival. In the days that followed, I quietly packed my belongings. Every book, every article of clothing, every keepsake I boxed up felt like a brick in the wall I was building to protect myself. On moving day, I expected one last confrontation, maybe even a screaming match. Instead, my mom came to my room in silence. She didn't offer a heartfelt apology or ask me to stay. She simply said, "Do you need more boxes?" and handed me a few old kitchen items, careful to keep the conversation light. The air between us was thick with everything unspoken. We tiptoed around our feelings like they were glass shards on the floor. It was easier to pretend everything was fine than to dig into the hurt. When I finally shut the door to my new place, a small but cozy apartment with creaky floorboards and yellowed blinds, I was overwhelmed by a cocktail of emotions. Relief surged first, quickly followed by a strange emptiness. No voices, no chaos, just silence. For the first few nights, the quiet was deafening. I found myself listening for footsteps, arguments, Jason's music blaring through the walls. But none of that came. It took time, but I grew into the silence. I could come and go when I pleased, eat when I was hungry, sleep without being jolted awake. It felt like I was slowly uncovering a version of myself I had hidden away for years. Someone who was capable, independent, and deserving of peace. Life settled into a rhythm. College classes during the day, work shifts in the evening, study sessions late at night. I stayed busy and I stayed out of trouble. My relationship with my mom and Martin stayed distant but civil. We weren't close, but at least the absence of proximity kept the drama at bay. Then came a curveball I hadn't expected. One evening my mom called. Her voice sounded different, lower, more careful. "Your stepdad's had a bit of a scare," she said, her tone trying to sound casual but failing. It wasn't anything life-threatening, she assured me, but it had been enough to shake him. He'd begun thinking seriously about the future, his legacy, his will. I stayed quiet, sensing that the real reason for her call was yet to come. "He's decided to include Jason and your little brother in the will," she said after a pause. "But not you. He says it just makes more sense. They're his biological kids." There it was, the final confirmation of something I had long suspected but never wanted to face. In Martin's eyes, I had never really been part of the family. I had been tolerated, perhaps, but never embraced, not truly. "It's okay," I said, voice flat. "Thanks for letting me know." I could hear the awkward tension on the other end of the line. My mom quickly added, "It's just legal stuff, you know. It doesn't change how we feel about you." "Right," I replied, not bothering to challenge the lie. We moved on to safer topics before the call ended, but the damage had already been done. That night, I lay awake in the dark, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, consumed by a dull, aching emptiness that had become all too familiar. I wasn't even surprised anymore. The hurt had lost its sharpness, replaced by a persistent numbness. I kept replaying that conversation with my mother, hesitant tone, the way she tried to soften the blow of Martin's decision, the casual cruelty of being excluded from the will. It looped in my mind like a song I couldn't skip, no matter how much I wanted to move on. For weeks afterward, the memory lingered like a bruise. I imagined what I might say if I confronted Martin, how I'd demand an explanation, how I'd force him to see the pain he caused. But the more I thought about it, the more I asked myself why it even mattered. Why did I still crave his acknowledgement, his approval? After all, I hadn't felt truly included in that family for years. This wasn't a new rejection, it was merely a confirmation of what I had always known deep down. So I withdrew, quietly. I started declining invitations, limiting visits to the bare minimum. It wasn't about being cold or dramatic, it was survival. I had to protect myself from further disappointment, from being hurt by people who had made it clear through words and actions that I was not a priority. Not when it really counted. But the real awakening didn't come in a fiery confrontation or a dramatic breakdown. It came in the most unexpected, quiet way. I was sitting in a cozy corner of a local coffee shop, my laptop open as I chipped away at a term paper. The place buzzed with soft conversation and clinking mugs. At the next table, a group of students laughed together, sharing stories about their parents, their childhoods, their families. They talked about siblings stealing clothes, awkward family vacations, and moms who called too often but meant well. I found myself frozen, listening. Not out of envy, but realization. I didn't have stories like that. I didn't have those warm, chaotic, loving memories. I hadn't had them in a very long time. Maybe never. That moment cracked something open in me, something I had tried for years to bury or ignore. I wasn't grieving the absence of a will or the lack of financial recognition. I was mourning the absence of love, of belonging, of family. And so I shifted my focus. I stopped mourning what I never had and started embracing what I did. The friends who had become like siblings, offering support and laughter without conditions. Professors who believed in my potential and took time to mentor me. Coworkers who respected me, who asked about my day and meant it. These people had shown up for me in ways my own family never truly did. I leaned into those relationships. I nurtured them, prioritized them. Slowly, piece by piece, the sting of being excluded from Martin's will began to fade. The pain didn't vanish overnight, There were still pangs, especially during holidays or family get-togethers when I'd see my stepbrother bask in attention, or my little half-brother get showered with affection, but those moments lost their power over me. I began to understand something vital. There are some things in life you cannot control. You cannot force someone to love you, to accept you, to see your worth, but you can choose who you let into your heart. You can choose to build a life around people who value you, not for obligation or bloodlines, but for who you truly are. That clarity was tested when Martin's health scare passed, and life in their household returned to normal. One afternoon I received an invitation, an awkward, impersonal text from my mom. They were hosting a dinner to celebrate Martin's recovery and wanted me to come. I debated for days. Part of me wanted to decline outright, but another part of me knew that refusing would only give them more ammunition for their narrative. So I went, out of obligation, not desire. The dinner was exactly what I expected, polite, stilted, and overflowing with forced cheer. Martin spoke at length about his recovery, dramatizing every detail. My half-brother received an avalanche of praise for some school project, and Jason boasted about his latest job opportunity with the same cocky arrogance he always carried. I sat at the edge of the table, nodding occasionally, sipping my drink, offering the occasional comment when addressed. No one asked how I was. No one brought up my studies, my job, my life. But for the first time, it didn't hurt. Not really. I had come to terms with my role. I was the outsider. And that was okay. Because beyond those walls, beyond that house, I had created something real. I had a life filled with genuine connections, people who saw me and appreciated me without conditions. When dessert was served, I made a polite excuse about needing to get up early for work. My mom offered a weak smile. Martin didn't even look up. I left without fanfare, slipped into my car, and drove away. Halfway home, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but peace. I had finally stopped chasing something that was never mine to begin with. Then, just as I had settled into this new rhythm of life, something completely unexpected happened. A phone call. The number was unfamiliar. I hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer. He introduced himself in a formal, almost apologetic tone, and asked if I had a few minutes to talk about the estate of a relative. My grandaunt. My father's mother's sister. I blinked, confused. I barely remembered her. She was one of those distant relatives you hear about in passing, someone mentioned in old family anecdotes. She never had children of her own, and I vaguely recalled visiting her once or twice as a child with my dad. I hadn't thought of her in years. "I'm calling to inform you," the lawyer said gently, "that your grandaunt passed away recently, and she left her entire estate to you." I sat in stunned silence. Entire estate? To say I was shocked is an understatement, I finally managed. "She had no close heirs," he continued, "but she specifically named you in her will. She's left behind a substantial estate, including a trust fund valued at approximately $3 million. The air left my lungs in a whoosh. My world tilted again, not with grief or anger but disbelief. Why me? We weren't close. Our interactions had been polite but distant. I had checked in on her a few times as a kid, but that was the extent of it. She must have seen something in me, perhaps a kindred spirit, someone who, like her, valued independence and solitude. The next several days blurred into a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and signatures. The lawyer explained everything with patience and clarity. My grandaunt had invested well, lived modestly, and prepared everything with meticulous care. She had chosen me, perhaps as a final act of quiet generosity, a gesture that said, "You mattered," even if no one else saw it. And just like that, everything changed. The inheritance wasn't just about the money. Alongside the sizable trust fund, my grandaunt had left behind properties, a diverse portfolio of stocks, and a few cherished personal items that clearly held deep sentimental value. Among them was a letter neatly folded, handwritten in careful script. It was her final message to me, one that explained why she had chosen to leave everything in my care. She wrote about how she had watched me from afar over the years, admired my resilience, my independence, and the fierce determination I'd shown in carving out a life for myself despite the odds. She said I reminded her of herself at that age, quietly fighting battles no one could see, refusing to become bitter, even when it would have been easy. It was a touching, unexpected gesture that left me both honored and deeply moved. Empowered by this newfound stability, I made a few immediate changes. First, I purchased a home. It wasn't extravagant, a 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had my own space that no one could take away. A place where I felt truly safe. The sense of control and security that came with turning the key in that front door was something I'd never experienced before. I didn't stop there. I also bought a small rental property nearby, a practical move to ensure long-term financial stability. I met with a financial advisor, someone highly recommended by my lawyer, and we laid out a plan. We diversified my investments, put a chunk of the money into high-yield savings accounts, and set up automatic donations to a few causes I cared about. I wanted to be responsible, to use this gift in a way that honored the woman who had trusted me with it. But as I soon discovered, great fortune tends to invite great complications, and, in my case, a mountain of family drama. Initially, I kept the inheritance to myself. I hadn't told a soul, not even my closest friends, let alone anyone in my family. I knew the kind of chaos that kind of information could stir up, and I wasn't eager to light that fuse. Unfortunately, secrets, especially the juicy kind, got wind of the inheritance through connections in the legal world. And once one person got wind of the inheritance through connections in the legal world, and once one person knew, it didn't take long before the news reached my mother. What followed was a tidal wave of phone calls, texts, and voicemails, not just from her, but from Martin, Jason, and even long-lost relatives I hadn't heard from in over a decade. Suddenly, I became the most popular person in the family. Everyone had a story, everyone had a reason. Times were tough, medical bills were piling up. "You know how bad your stepfather's health is," they'd say, as if that somehow erased years of neglect and mistreatment. The worst part wasn't the volume of the requests, it was the entitlement. There were no congratulations, no sincere curiosity about how I was doing or how this had come to be, just immediate, shameless requests for money. Some were phrased as polite inquiries, others as blatant demands. It felt like I was a carcass being circled by vultures, each waiting for their turn to peck. For a brief moment I wavered. I wondered if I was being selfish, if maybe sharing some of the wealth could mend old wounds or soften hardened hearts. But that moment passed quickly. I remembered all too vividly the years of being treated like a burden, the feeling of walking on eggshells, the countless sacrifices I had made just to survive in that house. I had put myself through college, I had worked weekends, nights, and holidays. No one had offered to help me then. This money wasn't just luck, it was a symbol of everything I had endured and everything I was finally free to pursue. When my mom finally called and directly asked why I hadn't shared the news with her, I knew it was time to draw the line. I kept my voice calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. I explained that this wasn't just about physical distance, it was about emotional distance, years in the making. I reminded her of the choices she had made, of the way Martin and Jason had treated me, and how she had stood by in silence. This inheritance is a chance for me to live on my own terms, I told her. It's not about hurting anyone, it's about finally choosing myself. Unsurprisingly, that conversation didn't go over well. The fallout was intense. I was accused of being ungrateful, of turning my back on my family, but I stood firm. The calls kept coming, but I stopped answering. The guilt-tripping messages turned into passive-aggressive silence. Eventually, they stopped altogether. And through all that noise, I gained clarity. I realized that family isn't always about blood or legality. True family are the people who show up, who support you without strings attached. I focused my energy on those relationships. My best friend who always had a seat for me at her table, the professors who continued to mentor me, the coworkers who had become something like siblings. These were the people who cared about me, not my bank account. The inheritance, in many ways, remained a bittersweet symbol. I often wished I had known my grandaunt better. She had seen something in me that even my own parents hadn't. Her final act wasn't just about passing down money. It was about recognizing my strength and perhaps giving me the push I needed to stand tall. But if I thought the drama was over, I was wrong. Once it became clear that I wasn't going to be handing out free checks to every relative with a sob story, the tone shifted sharply. Those early messages dripping with fake concern gave way to accusations, insults, and manipulative pleas. Even people I hadn't seen since childhood suddenly wanted to reconnect. Their texts a flimsy attempt to justify asking for help. One of the most difficult confrontations came from Martin. He called one afternoon, his voice measured but cold. "You know," he began, "we've always considered you part of this family. It's only fair that you think of your brothers during a time like this." The audacity nearly knocked the wind out of me. I took a breath, then replied, "My brothers only consider me family when they need something. The rest of the time, I'm invisible." "That's a harsh thing to say," he replied, clearly rattled. "Maybe," I said, "but it's the truth." The call spiraled from there, Martin accusing me of selfishness, me finally speaking out about years of being pushed aside and made to feel less than. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I simply stated the facts, letting years of silence finally speak. And by the end of it, something shifted. The conversation with Martin ended the way most of our exchanges did, bitter, unresolved, and dripping with mutual resentment. We didn't yell, we didn't scream, we just reached that boiling point where no words could fix what had already shattered. When the call disconnected, it left behind a silence that carried a weight heavier than any argument. It wasn't just the end of a conversation, it was the end of pretending that things between us were ever going to be normal again. And if that wasn't enough, my mom's attempt at playing peacemaker was the final crack that broke everything wide open. She didn't call ahead, she simply showed up at my door one afternoon carrying a tray of cookies like we were in some kind of wholesome family sitcom. I knew from the look in her eyes that this wasn't a social visit. She wanted something. She always did. We sat in my living room, the air thick with tension, her hand fidgeting in her lap. "It's what families do," she said at one point, her voice gentle, pleading. "We help each other, we share." I took a deep breath, already feeling the exhaustion creep in. "Families also support each other," I replied, carefully choosing my words. "When have you ever supported me emotionally or financially?" She opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. The silence that followed was the most honest moment we'd shared in years. Our relationship had always been superficial, a string of polite conversations and forced smiles. We played the roles of mother and child, but the bond was hollow. This inheritance didn't break us, it just dragged the truth into the light. After that visit, the calls slowed, the messages trickled down to nothing, and while I felt relief, I also felt a sting of finality that cut deeper than I expected. It was in that silence that I found clarity. I stopped trying to win their approval and turned my attention to the people who truly saw me. I deepened friendships that had long sustained me. I opened myself up to new connections, people who didn't know my past, who weren't tied to old expectations or family drama. I even started volunteering at a local literacy center, working with kids and young adults who needed a bit of help getting back on track. It gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. And for the first time, I sought professional help. Therapy had always seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford, financially or emotionally. But now I had the means and, more importantly, the will. I needed to understand why I had let these people hurt me for so long, why I kept seeking validation from people who never offered it freely. My therapist helped me unpack years of pain, guided me through the layers of trauma, and helped me see that setting boundaries wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of self-respect. It was during one of our sessions that I had the idea to write letters to each family member who had tried to guilt or pressure me. Not out of revenge or bitterness, but as a way to finally speak my truth. I poured my heart into those letters, explaining what their actions had meant to me, how they had hurt me, and why I had made the decisions I did. I didn't expect any replies. I just needed to say my piece and move on. To my surprise, my half-brother wrote back. He was only 14, just a kid caught in the crossfire of adult issues, but his letter was sincere in a way that disarmed me. "I'm sorry for asking for money," he wrote. "I miss you." It wasn't eloquent, but it didn't need to be. Those few lines were more heartfelt than anything I had heard from the rest of the family in years. We started texting. At first it was small stuff, how school was going, what books he was reading, funny things he'd seen online. But it was real, and that meant everything to me. It felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth salvaging. But life, as it tends to do, threw another curveball. It was late August when my mom reached out again. She wanted to talk. Cautiously, I agreed to meet in a public cafe, hoping that a neutral setting would keep emotions from boiling over. From the moment she sat down, I could tell she had an agenda. She started with the usual small talk, how hard things had been financially, how Martin's health had taken a toll, how private school tuition was becoming unmanageable, and how much she needed a break, maybe a vacation to reset. She didn't ask a single question about me. Not how I was doing, not how I had been coping, not even a hollow "how are you?" And then, like a switch had flipped, she got to the point. She asked me for $1 million. Yes, $1 million. She said it casually, as if she were asking for a glass of water. She claimed that technically the money was hers, since it came from my father's side of the family. She even tried to make it sound like she was doing me a favor, only asking for a third of what she believed she was entitled to. I stared at her in disbelief. The betrayal hit like a punch to the chest. I didn't say much. I just paid the bill and left, walking out of the cafe without looking back. After that, the situation unraveled completely. She started telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen money that should have been hers. She painted herself as the victim, the wronged mother. And Martin? He chimed in with a lengthy text message full of guilt-tripping and self-righteousness. He lectured me about family values, about thinking of the bigger picture, about how I was letting selfishness tear us apart. I replied with a single message. You didn't include me in your will because I wasn't family enough. That's all I needed to know. He didn't respond. But I know this isn't over. They've started a full-blown campaign to discredit me, to turn relatives and friends against me. They twist the story, omit the years of mistreatment, and portray me as the villain who turned her back on family after coming into money. It's exhausting, it's terrifying, and it's deeply unfair. But through all of it, I've held on to one truth. I have a right to protect myself. I have a right to peace. I have a right to say no. I am not the villain in this story. Things have gotten harder than I ever anticipated, but I'll keep you all updated if anything else unfolds. Right now, it honestly feels like I'm stuck in the middle of a storm with no clear end in sight. Despite everything, I truly want to thank everyone who's reached out with support, advice, or even just a kind word. Knowing there are people out there who understand what I'm going through, who genuinely care, has been a powerful reminder that I'm not alone in this. Hey everyone, it's me again, just dropping in with a major update, and when I say major, I mean buckle up, because it's wild level of major. These past few weeks have been a complete roller coaster. Emotions all over the place, unexpected drama, and new developments I never saw coming. I've been trying to keep it together and stay grounded, but wow, life really doesn't slow down for anyone, does it? So, here's what happened. A few weeks ago, I got this incredibly formal, official-looking letter in the mail. It had all the markings of something serious, thick paper, embossed letterhead, and a tone that practically screamed, "We mean business." At first, I thought it was junk mail, maybe a weird marketing gimmick or something from my bank. But no. As I kept reading, the truth hit me like a slap to the face. It was from a lawyer, or someone claiming to be a lawyer, and the letter was informing me that my own mother was suing me. Yes, you read that correctly. My mother, filing a lawsuit against me over the inheritance. I don't even know how to describe the shock I felt. It was like every ounce of my breath had been knocked out of me in one swift blow. My first reaction? Pure panic. My heart was racing, my thoughts were spiraling. I couldn't sleep that night, or the next. All I could think about were worst-case scenarios. Lawyers, court dates, legal fees. The headlines in my head read like a tabloid nightmare. And as if the letter weren't enough to send me into a tailspin, my stepdad decided to add fuel to the fire. He sent me a text that honestly looked like it was ripped straight from a cheap soap opera. "You'll regret not sharing your money," he wrote, "because now we're going to take you for everything you're worth." I stared at that message, dumbfounded. It didn't even feel real. It was so cartoonishly villainous that I half expected the next message to be an evil laugh emoji. Once I snapped out of the initial shock, I did what anyone would do. I sent everything over to my attorney. I braced myself for the worst, expecting him to outline a long, expensive legal battle ahead. But what happened next was surprising. He laughed. Not a little chuckle, not an awkward cough. I mean a full-on belly laugh. He read the letter, looked at me and said, "This is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen." He tossed the letter aside and told me not to worry. According to him, my grandaunt's will was ironclad, bulletproof, rock solid. She had spelled out her wishes in detail, named me specifically as the sole beneficiary, and crucially, my mother wasn't listed anywhere because she wasn't a legal descendant. Still, my attorney didn't stop there. He's meticulous, and he decided to do a bit of investigating, just in case. He looked into the law firm that supposedly sent the letter. Turns out, the address on the letterhead led to a dilapidated building that hadn't had tenants in years. The phone number? Disconnected. No website, no legal registration. Basically, the whole thing was a scare tactic, a poorly disguised bluff. Realizing that my mother and stepdad had stooped so low as to invent a fake lawyer to intimidate me was a mix of emotions. On the one hand, I felt relieved. Legally, I was in the clear, but emotionally, it was like being punched all over again. The lengths they were willing to go, the desperation, it was staggering. Once the fear subsided, what I felt was sadness, deep, aching disappointment. These were the people who were supposed to protect me, to love me, to put my well-being first. Instead, they were using underhanded threats and cheap theatrics to try and bully me into handing over something that was never theirs to begin with. So, I decided I needed a break. All the stress, the insomnia, the knots in my stomach, I couldn't keep living like that. I reached out to a few close friends and suggested something we'd been talking about for years but never acted on. A road trip. Nothing extravagant, just a few stops along the coast, maybe a national park or two, some hiking, some laughter, and most importantly, some peace. We made plans, booked the time off, packed our bags, and hit the road. And it was everything I needed. The open road, windows down, music blasting, junk food in the back seat, and the kind of laughter that makes your ribs hurt. It reminded me what life was supposed to feel like. Free, joyful, unburdened. One night, as we camped beneath a canopy of stars, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. A year ago, I was living under the same roof as people who treated me like an afterthought. Now, I had financial independence, my own home, a network of friends who lifted me up, and a therapist who was helping me rediscover my worth. It still stung, knowing how my family had treated me. The wounds weren't gone, but they were healing, slowly. And as much as it hurt to admit, I was better off keeping my distance. Since returning from the trip, I've been focusing on moving forward, building a life that's mine, on my terms. The inheritance, once a source of turmoil, is now a tool I use to create stability, to invest in my passions, and to help others on my terms, not through obligation or guilt. I don't know what my mom and stepdad will try next. Maybe they'll go silent, maybe they'll try another trick. But I'm ready now. They no longer get to dictate how I live or how I feel. And that's the real inheritance: peace.